right now, we're going to go ahead and transition into our first session, and we're going to learn a little bit about phosphorus, your plate, navigating nutrition, and kidney disease. And our presenter is Nadia Marzella. And Nadia is a registered dietitian, one of my favorite healthcare providers, and a certified specialist in renal nutrition. She began her dietetics career in acute care before transitioning to dialysis 14 years ago. Currently, she serves as the Strategic Nutrition Services Manager for Fresenius Medical Care in the Atlanta, Georgia area, and is the former chair of the Georgia Renal Nutrition Association. In 2023, Nadia was honored as the Georgia Renal Dietitian of the Year. Woo, woo! Way to go, Nadia. And in her free time, she enjoys cooking, gardening, and participating in outdoor activities. Nadia, we're so glad to have you here with us at Hope Week. We're all looking forward to what information you have to share. Are you ready to get going?
Sure, absolutely. Well,
Excellent.
thank you for the great introduction. Again, my name is Nadia Marzella, and I've been working in dialysis a while now. Um, Good afternoon or good evening, I guess, depending on where you're joining us from. And I've been asked today to give remarks specific to phosphorus in your plate. So we'll look at phosphorus in general and what it is and what it does within the body, but we'll concentrate mostly on diet and how you can really manage your phosphorus by way of the foods that you're eating. And so, without further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen. I'll admit I'm more used to using Teams than I am Zoom, but I think I can get this to work. Hold on just a second. All right.
I
So
can
when
see.
we talk about, can you see my screen
I
at this
can. It
point?
looks great.
Okay, perfect. So when I like to start out with what is phosphorus, and this is a question that I ask of my patients on a regular basis. And, usually when I ask that question, I get an answer along the lines of, oh, it's that lab value that's just really tricky for me to keep into control, or it's that thing in food that is just found everywhere, and it's so difficult for me to limit the amount that I'm eating. But in reality, phosphorus does actually do important things in our body. It's not just a useless type of mineral that's out there, you know, um, kind of bothering us and pestering us in dialysis. We store and use most of our phosphorus by way of a mineral, and it's found in our bones and also our teeth. But there are some other functions of phosphorus that we don't often think about. One of them is that it's a really essential building block within the body. All of our cell membranes have phosphorus in them. We also require phosphorus to do anything. It's a part of our energy molecules. So, just lifting your arm to write something on a piece of paper, again, you're using phosphorus anytime you're burning energy. And our DNA also contains phosphorus. And one thing we don't think a whole lot about, but phosphorus is an electrolyte. It helps us with muscle contraction and nerve conduction. So without phosphorus, we wouldn't be able to do a whole lot of things. We're going to concentrate today really on this first one because the vast majority of the phosphorus in our body is really found as a mineral. It's found in the bones and the teeth. It's not to say these other things aren't important, they certainly are. But again, because of just the sheer amount of phosphorus we find in these two, that's where we will start. So when we start talking about our bones and the minerals that make up our bones, um, we've got to really look at not just phosphorus, but also calcium and magnesium because the three together are really what make up good, healthy bone. And a lot of us think, well, I've been around. I'm in my late 40s now, so I've been around for almost 5 decades. That my bones that I was born with are the same ones that I have today. But in reality, our bones are constantly remodeling and rebuilding. So depending on what you're eating and what concentration of these calcium, phosphorus, magnesium you have in the bloodstream, your bones can either remodel and make good, healthy, strong bone, or somewhat weaker bone based on different concentrations. When we look at different organs in the body, our bones store most of our calcium and phosphorus. Our intestines absorb it. So, from the foods that we're eating that contain calcium and phosphorus, it's really our intestines that are responsible for getting that from the food to where it's needed at the bone. The kidneys and the parathyroid gland are interesting because these two organ systems actually help us to regulate how much calcium and phosphorus is in the body. So, the kidneys are where we excrete the extra. So, if you take in more calcium than the body needs right now in building healthy bone, usually with healthy kidneys, you'd just be able to get rid of it and excrete it by way of urine. It's once the kidneys slow down that we start to have a little bit more of a problem of keeping these in control because we're just not able to get rid of the extra. And then the parathyroid gland, this helps us to regulate our calcium and phosphorus. So anytime calcium drops low in our bloodstream, the parathyroid gland, there are four of them. They're in the neck. They sit on top of the thyroid. Those glands jump into high gear and they release a hormone that really helps us to absorb more calcium. So this is a very busy graph. We're not going to get into a lot of detail with it, but what I did want to show and have everyone look at was the purple bar, which is the phosphorus or the phosphate. Down at the bottom of the graph, we have kidney function being measured by the glomerular filtration rate or the GFR. So on the left-hand side, we have pretty normal kidney function for somebody over the age of 40, a GFR of greater than 90. And on the far right-hand side, we have a GFR that's closer to 15. That would be somebody who was thinking about starting dialysis. So we look in this middle part of the graph, we have a grayed out area. That is the normal range for each one of these minerals. And so the normal range for phosphorus being somewhere between 3 and 5.5. And you can see that for quite some time as the kidneys slow down, the phosphorus actually stays normal. It's not until we get to the way end, right before we start thinking about initiating dialysis, that the phosphorus really takes a very sharp turn upward. And so the kidneys, for a long time, are able to do a great job of getting rid of the extra phosphorus and balancing it in the bloodstream. It's just when we get to that point where the kidneys are really, really kind of tuckered out and not working well for us anymore that we start to see the phosphorus increase. So, again, when the kidneys can no longer excrete phosphorus, we start to see calcium build up, phosphorus. We also see higher levels of that parathyroid hormone because the kidneys are also responsible for breaking that down and getting rid of it. So, how do we manage phosphorus? Well, there's actually not just one way, there are three ways, and they work kind of symbiotically together to help us keep our phosphorus in a healthy range. There's one medication company out there, and I won't name the name of the drug, but they use all of their education materials, say the three Ds: dialysis, diet, and drugs. And so these are the three ways we manage phosphorus: removal by dialysis, diet control, and also medications that help us manage phosphorus. So I'll briefly touch on this first one, phosphorus removal by dialysis. I get asked this question without fail every single month when I'm passing out labs to patients. Um, Patients will say, well, doesn't dialysis remove some of the phosphorus? And the answer is overwhelmingly yes, dialysis does remove some phosphorus. But the devil's really in the details. We've got to look at how much dialysis is getting rid of versus how much we tend to take in the body. And so for men, average man takes in about 1,600 milligrams of phosphorus from the whole foods that they eat every day. Women, we eat a little bit less. And so on average, about 1,000 milligrams of phosphorus from food. But that's only phosphorus that's naturally found in food. Processed foods, and especially foods that we eat outside of the home, fast foods, convenience foods, even restaurant foods, tend to have a lot of phosphorus additives. So the more of those foods that you tend to eat, you also have to account for not just the phosphorus that's naturally found in the food, but the phosphorus that's added to it. So when somebody who eats a fairly processed diet, they may see an additional 1,000 milligrams a day of phosphorus additives. So that's over on top of what they were already eating from their food. So a man who has a fairly processed diet gets 1,600 milligrams from their natural food and an additional 1,000 from those processed foods. So it was upwards of 2,600 milligrams in a day. And again, for a woman who eats a fairly processed diet, it could be as high as 2,000 milligrams of phosphorus from food per day. So then we look at dialysis. Well, the average 3 to 4 hour hemodialysis session removes about 800 milligrams of phosphorus. So if you have dialysis 3 times a week, that's 2,400 milligrams of phosphorus that's being removed. And that's in a week. If you've got this gentleman here who's eating a processed diet, 2,600 milligrams of phosphorus per day, dialysis is really only removing 1 day's worth of phosphorus intake over the course of a week. Those other 6 days, all of that phosphorus that was taken in is going to end up in the bloodstream. So, the answer to the question that we had posed earlier, can dialysis remove phosphorus? Yes, absolutely it can. It removes some, but we've really got to rely on these other two components, the diet as well as the drugs or the medications, to truly get us into good, healthy range with phosphorus. So, I'm going to spend a lot more time in this middle one, the diet control. Of course, it's my wheelhouse as a dietitian, but also it was the topic of our presentation today. So, phosphorus is found in a lot of different foods. And I think that's probably the biggest complaint that I get from most patients is, gosh, it just seems when I look at a list of foods that contain phosphorus, it's everywhere. And the answer is it really is. It's found in most of the things that we eat. But I'm going to try to break that down today and point everybody towards foods that are better choices versus ones that maybe become a little bit more problematic when it comes to phosphorus in the diet. So, phosphorus can really come from these two big categories, organic and inorganic. And this has nothing to do with organic produce and pesticides and that type of thing. Organic in this particular format is just talking about phosphorus that's naturally found in those foods. It's not been added, it's not a processing agent, it's just there from the beginning. And so we have some plant foods that are organic sources of phosphorus. We also have some animal foods that are organic sources of phosphorus. And then we have inorganic. These are foods where the phosphorus wasn't there in the first place, it was added after the food was produced. And so these are largely our phosphorus additives. So, in breaking these down and looking at them all individually, we'll start with the plants. So, again, this is organic phosphorus. It's found there from the beginning. When we talk about phosphorus from plants, it usually comes from beans, nuts, and seeds. And anything that's made with those beans, nuts, or seeds. So you've got peanut butter on the screen. Again, it's made from peanuts, so it is going to have phosphorus in it. If we were to make something like hummus, which is made from beans, it's made from chickpeas, it would also contain phosphorus because, again, it comes from beans, nuts, or seeds. When it comes to plant based foods and the phosphorus that's found in those foods, that phosphorus is really tricky to get at. And that's because the phosphorus is bound to something called phytates. And phytates really, they give the phosphorus an incredibly tight hug. So when that phosphorus and phytate, it gets into the gut, it gets into the intestines have a really tough time breaking those two things apart. And so in the end, about 30 to 50% of the phosphorus, so about a third of it, if you want to think of it that way, one third gets into the bloodstream, and two-thirds of it ends up leaving the body by way of feces or stool when you go to the bathroom. So when it comes to plants, we get about a third of the phosphorus from that plant food ending up in our bloodstream. Animal foods aren't a whole lot different here. So when we talk about phosphorus from animal foods, we look at milk and dairy, and we also look at animal meats, whether it's chicken, fish, turkey, shellfish, any type of animal meat or seafood meat is going to, of course, have some phosphorus in it. When it comes to animal foods and in the phosphorus, that phosphorus is bound to protein. Now, the gut can do a little bit of a better job dealing with this, but not a whole lot better. We really only absorb about half of the phosphorus from our animal food, somewhere between 40 and 60% of it. So if you drink a glass of milk, half of the phosphorus from the milk is going to end up in the bloodstream, and half of it's going to again, leave the body when you go to the bathroom. So a third of our plant-based foods and about a half of our animal-based foods will absorb the phosphorus from. When it comes to additives, these are a lot more readily available. So, when we look at foods that have phosphorus additives, these additives are placed there by the food industry for a wide variety of reasons. In some of the foods, it's a flavor thing. So, I'm looking at the Coca Cola on the screen, but this really goes for any type of dark colored soda like Coke or Pepsi, Diet Coke, Diet Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, even some of our fruit punch drinks like Hawaiian Punch. The phosphorus is in a form called phosphoric acid, and it's there because it gives a nice sharp flavor. It kind of hits that back side of the tongue and gives you the flavor that you would expect with a dark colored soda. Um, and that's the sole reason why it's there is for flavor. You look at something like the Hostess Ho-Hos that are there at the top, and this goes for any type of cracker, cookie, snack cake in the store. The phosphorus that's there is there for two reasons. It's a leavening agent, makes it puffy and rise, and it's also there to keep that product shelf stable for a long period of time. I like to tell my patients if you bake your own chocolate chip cookies at home, within 4 or 5 days, if they weren't put in the freezer or really stored well in a nice airtight container, they start to go stale. But you buy cookies in the store, some of them have been sitting there for 6 months. And again, it's that long shelf life that the food manufacturers are trying to get from adding phosphorus to those foods. When we look at something like Bisquick, and I hate to just, call out Bisquick, this is really any type of a quick bread type product, whether it's muffin mix or whether it's pancake mix or biscuit mix. These type of products, they use the phosphorus for a rise, for that leavening agent. And so make sure your pancakes or your cookies or your muffins that you're cooking, it makes them rise and really get nice and light and fluffy. But unfortunately, again, these sources of phosphorus, because they're not bound heavily to the phytates or the protein like we saw in the organic phosphorus, the body can just break it apart really easily. So when you drink something like a Coke, almost 100% of the phosphorus from that Coke ends up in the bloodstream versus only 50% from the steak or only 30% from the beans. So when I work with my patients, we start here. We work on phosphorus additives first, and 9 times out of 10, we're able to get the phosphorus under control by just picking out a handful of foods that we've got to really modulate within the additive category. And then if we can't get it, then we start looking at some of the more natural foods. But I always start here. So again, I'll go back to the question that I posed a little bit earlier. Phosphorus seems to be in everything that we eat, from beans to peanut butter to milk to steak to, all of these snack foods that we enjoy. So what can you eat? And how do we get rid of the phosphorus or limit it in the diet without, losing weight, becoming malnourished by not having enough to eat? And so I'll go over a couple different slides to kind of help you see what I'm thinking about when I'm looking at somebody's diet and we're talking together. So the first thing that we can think about is just the sheer amount of phosphorus in the food. And so I've got 6 different foods here. I've got an egg, it has about 5 milligrams of phosphorus. A Coke, it has about 40 milligrams. You've got a couple different types of cheese here. We've got the processed American cheese that has about 211 milligrams of phosphorus, and mozzarella cheese that's freshly shredded that has about 149 milligrams. And then we have 2 protein sources down here. We have skim milk at 247 milligrams of phosphorus, and we have a chicken breast with 180 milligrams of phosphorus. So if I were to just take these foods and rank them lowest amount of phosphorus to highest amount of phosphorus, I'd put the egg first. It has the lowest amount at 5. The second lowest food would be the Coke. It only has 40 milligrams. So we'd go egg, Coke. We've got the cheeses in the middle. So the mozzarella cheese with 149, the chicken breast with 180, and then we'd have the American cheese and the skim milk. And that's how we would rank the foods if all we were thinking about is the amount of phosphorus in the food. But we also have to think about what else we get from these foods and what other benefits. And so I also have the number of grams of protein listed here. And so you can see when we look at something like the egg, it has 4 grams of protein. The Coke, less than a gram, but the chicken breast has 23. So if I want to take those things into consideration, I would look at the number of milligrams of phosphorus and compare it to the amount of protein and come up with somewhat of a ratio or a number. And if I rank the foods now, the egg still is the best choice. It has the 1.25 as the ratio because it's got a lot of protein for just a very small amount of phosphorus. But number 2 would be my chicken breast because even though the chicken breast has a moderate amount of phosphorus, it has a ton of protein. And so it's still a healthy food to choose. The food that would come in last place, dead last, would be the dark colored soda or the Coke, because even though the phosphorus is, it doesn't seem like a lot on paper at 40 milligrams, you're not getting much nutrition out of that Coke. The protein's less than a gram. And so, really, when we talk about phosphorus to protein ratio, it is the highest that we have here of these foods. Another thing you want to still keep in mind is what we already talked about, the fact that the phosphorus from some of our plant foods and our animal foods is just not real readily absorbed. And so up at the top, I have a cup of lentils. And, if I were to compare that to the 6 foods that I had on the previous slide, this would by far be the highest amount of phosphorus at 365 milligrams. And I remember when I first became a dietitian, it's been a little over 20 years now, being taught that patients who are on dialysis shouldn't have these plant-based foods because they're just so outrageously high in phosphorus. But that is not current modern day thinking. Now we know that the phosphorus that's in some of these plant foods is not real easily absorbed. And so remember, you absorb about a third of the phosphorus from your lentils. And so really that 365 milligrams, it starts looking a little bit more like 120 milligrams when you consider how little of it is absorbed. And so my bottom line here is that plant-based foods still can play a very important and a very healthy role in a dialysis or a renal diet. Even though they do contain phosphorus and sometimes the label or something you read online might shy you away from these type of foods, you don't absorb as much phosphorus as you think from these foods. And so for that reason, they still can be a very good choice. Another thing that I get asked rather frequently from patients is, well, can I just read labels and find the phosphorus there? And the answer is yes and no. So when it comes to what's required by law on the nutrition facts on a food label in the graphic format, phosphorus is not required to be listed. There are some efforts out there that are trying to twist the arm of the FDA to consider it in the future because believe it or not, phosphorus is not just a concern for people who are on dialysis. There's a lot of newer research that's coming out that's suggesting that even for people with healthy, good kidney function, this amount of phosphorus that we have in our diet today with all of the additives is perhaps bad for everybody's heart. So you may see it in the future, but today it is not required to be listed there by law. Where we will find phosphorus on the food label is in the ingredient list. And when it's in the ingredient list, it's always going to be a phosphorus additive because the ingredient list doesn't contain the natural phosphorus that's going to be found in the food. So some of the most common additives that are out there, phosphoric acid, that's found in all of your beverages and drinks that contain phosphorus. The sodium polyphosphate, this is the leavening agent that you find in those quick bread products like the Bisquick. Pyrophosphate, trisodium polyphosphate, polyphosphatase, tricalcium phosphate, hexamethylphosphatase, trisodium phosphate, and calcium phosphate. You'll find all of these common additives in different foods that you eat. So I'm going to flip to the next slide, and I'm going to be quiet for a second, give everybody a second to really look through this. This is the ingredient list by just looking at, I actually don't know exactly what this product is, but by looking at the first 5 ingredients, I'm going to guess it's some type of a chocolate beverage, whether it's a Yoo-hoo or something like a Carnation Instant Breakfast. And I'll give you a second to look through these ingredients and try to count up how many of those ingredients have that PHOS or have a phosphate additive to it. And I've got the answer on the next slide. We found three. So there was magnesium phosphate, calcium phosphate, and also pyrophosphate. And again, just one product, and we found three different additives that were put in there, probably for completely different reasons. Um, again, as a processing agent in this particular food. So when I'm working with my patients, I really have kind of five talking points that we start with when we're really trying to dig deep into why somebody's phosphorus is high. And the first of those is shopping smart and reading labels. Now, that may sound like a huge task, and quite frankly, if you read every single label on every single food you picked up at the grocery store, you would probably be in the store for 4 hours. It would be an enormous task. And so I do break this down. We really start first and foremost with beverages. Um, it is a big source of that readily available, easily broken down phosphorus. And so, when I'm working with somebody who's trying to lower their phosphorus, I'll say for this next week, all I want you to think about and worry about is what you're drinking. If you're picking up something at, the gas station and, it's a bottled beverage, a bottled tea, look at that label, flip it over and see if you can find any phosphorus additives. If you're buying, a gallon of lemonade at the store, again, read that label, take a peek at it, see if there's phosphorus additives to it. And then when we, have kind of exhausted our beverages, we'll move on to snack foods and then move on to some of the other foods that a person may be eating. So instead of trying to read all labels at once, we break it down and we start with different categories of food and just trying to find kind of hidden sources of phosphorus that you never knew was there. I've been a renal dietitian for 14, almost 15 years. And I had a patient stump me just this very last week. For the first time in my life, I saw, I didn't even realize this food could have phosphorus in it, but syrup. I mean, regular maple syrup that they were putting on pancakes at home. She brought it in. She first of all told me, I read the label and there's phosphorus in it. I said, no way, and she brought it in and sure enough, there it was. So, it is really, truly amazing what you will sometimes find just reading a few labels. The next thing that I always work with on with my patients is dialysis patients need a lot of protein. You lose a lot of protein just sitting in the treatment chair and receiving treatment 3 times a week. And so it's still very important to have that protein. And even though it contains some phosphorus, we look at choosing natural sources of protein and trying to eliminate some of the frozen and the fast and the processed foods that have a lot of added phosphorus. Dairy, most of us just we enjoy dairy, even if you're not a milk drinker, most of us enjoy whether it's a dairy dessert or, cheese in the diet from time to time. And it still should be an important part of a diet when you're on dialysis, because again, if it's a food you're used to eating, it's something that's enjoyable, it should still be there. But limiting dairy to 1 to 2 servings a day and kind of choosing wisely by saying, well, I just really can't, I'm from an Italian background. I just can't eat my dinner without some cheese. So I'm going to avoid something earlier in the day, perhaps a glass of milk that I have between breakfast and lunch, so that I can save that dairy choice for later in the day. When we look at a meal plan, of course, we're bringing in protein. Always want to have fruits and vegetables in the diet, even though some of these can be higher in potassium, which is outside of this talk. They're such great sources of vitamins and minerals as well as fiber. And, the number one thing that dialysis patients succumb to when it comes to different, conditions is heart disease. And so we really don't want to eliminate the great sources of things like fiber and vitamins and minerals. And then finally, looking at the breads and grains. And then cooking at home. You know, some of my patients love to cook, and this is the first thing we start with because it's real easy. And then I have others who, either don't have a lot of the time or energy, or perhaps live alone and just, feel like there's too much waste with cooking at home. And so we slowly work our way into trying to incorporate more home cooking and less eating out to try to bring the phosphorus down. So again, we talked about phosphorus removal by dialysis. It removes some, but not enough to stand on its own. Diet control, again, we can cut back the phosphorus in the diet, but we can't totally eliminate it because it's found in so many of the different foods that we eat. So again, we're adding these three together. We got the phosphorus removal by dialysis. We're controlling a little bit with what we're eating. And then the last thing is the medications, the phosphorus binders. And this goes a little bit beyond, what I was asked to talk about today. So I'm going to sort of leave it with this slide, but really how our different medications work in phosphorus binders is the medication goes into the body, it breaks apart in the stomach and sometimes the small intestine, depending on what medication you're taking, and it sits there, it lurks, like I often say, or it acts like a magnet, and it's waiting for phosphorus to come into the gut. And as soon as it senses phosphorus, these binders will jump on it and they will bind to it. And once the binder and the phosphorus are together, they form this great big molecule that the body can't break apart and absorb. And so it ends up being excreted in the stool. All of our phosphorus binders are positively charged molecules. So, in the case of our iron based binders, we've got positively charged iron. In the case of our calcium based binders, we have positively charged calcium. We've got the two binders that are a little bit more of a funky molecule, Renvela and phosrenol, but both of those are again positively charged molecules. And phosphorus is negatively charged, and that's how they work so well together, just like a magnet, that positive and negative charge stick together. And so, while all of the binders work the same way in theory within the body, they all form this big, gigantic molecule that just can't be absorbed. So, by putting all three things together, removing some phosphorus by way of dialysis, limiting some of what we're eating by way of phosphorus in the diet, and finally taking those medications to really just give us that absorption of that last portion of the phosphorus that we weren't able to remove by dialysis or cut back from the diet. That's where we really get that good tight control with phosphorus. So I left some time for questions at the end, and so I'll open up the floor at this point in time. Anything from this talk or anything else in nutrition, I'm open to take a stab at it for you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Nadia. How about why don't you go ahead and take down your slide if you can? Wonderful. So that way we can have a discussion and also field the questions that people have submitted. And that was a very informative presentation. I appreciate it because I was diagnosed with kidney disease back in 97 and I chose PD and I was a pescatarian.
Mhm.
And, I was greeted over and over and over again with, oh no,
Yeah.
a
Yep.
pescatarian. And now, I mean, the thing is that my labs weren't bad and I had the best albumin levels in the entire clinic. I
Mhm.
did. So your labs don't lie, right? If your
Right.
labs are doing good, you're doing something right. And so I'm glad that the science changed, and I was just lucky, right? Because
Mhm.
most of the time, what the patient prefers isn't going to be the answer.
Isn't listened to.
I just lucked out. But we have a question from
Sure.
Arlene in the chat, and hi, Arlene. It's good to see you. Regarding absorption of phosphorus, which intestine, large or small, is mostly involved?
It's mainly the small intestine. So we absorb most of our nutrients in the small intestine, and the large intestine largely reabsorbs water. So whenever, everything's leaving the small intestine, it's very liquid form at that point in time, and it firms up in the large intestine because of the water absorption. But phosphorus is actually absorbed in the first third of the small intestine. It's that very first portion coming out of the stomach.
Great question. Tracy, how does taking binders help with absorbing phosphate in your food? Should you take a binder with everything you eat?
So, I mean, it's up to your physician how they order binders because, I have some patients who don't have to take one with everything that they eat because they can manage phosphorus without that. And then I have others that it's everything that they put in their mouth. They've really got to take a binder with it. But again, I like to think of it like a magnet. In fact, we have an activity that we'll do in our clinic about once a year. And I bring in bowls, like regular dinner bowls, fill them with paper clips, and then we take magnets, and each magnet can hold about 10 paper clips, and so you'll see, you'll put 2 or 3 into the bowl, and how much phosphorus, that's the idea of how much it's absorbing. So again, you've got those positively charged binders, all of them have a positive charge, and the negatively charged phosphorus, and they just really find each other in the gut and stick together and form something that's just so large it can't be broken apart and absorbed in the body.
Great question. And then we have some over in the chat as well. Um, Donna wanted to know, and I am right on board with her on this one. I hear I should be eating a lot of protein, so Donna must be on dialysis, right? What about fried shrimp as far as phosphorus? And I'm a big lover of fried shrimp too. So, if it's sketchy, you have to give us some kind of hope of some different way to prepare it,
Yeah,
or eat less, or maybe have it once a week. I mean,
well, that is exactly, I think you hit the nail on the head with how it's prepared. So, when it comes to fried foods and fried proteins, a lot of times you'll see these listed on, if you're given a list by your dietitian or your doctor that says which foods are high in phosphorus, a lot of times it will have fried foods listed there. But it's all the details are very important of how that food is fried. So if it's something that's pre-frozen, it's going to be high in phosphorus, because that is one thing that phosphorus additives do, is if you're going to take meat or protein and put it in the freezer, it really becomes a bit funky. The way the protein breaks down, you start forming water crystals in the middle of the meat, and then you go to fry it and it's just a gooey mess. And so they add or coat those foods in phosphorus to prevent those ice crystals from forming in the food. But if you're freshly breading shrimp and frying it, the phosphorus isn't there. They did it That shrimp didn't get coated in the phosphorus to be frozen. So again, if it is fresh shrimp, it has not been frozen, and it's breaded and fried, it's really going to be a fairly good choice when it comes to a low phosphorus protein.
okay, great answers. So if you don't live close to a beach, it's a little harder, right?
Correct. And so
Uh,
you'd want to, in that case, maybe just limit how often you were having it. If it's a fried shrimp product that you're getting in the freezer section, it's okay to have from time to time. It wouldn't be something that you'd want to have 4 times a week for dinner, because again, it will be a little bit higher in phosphorus.
Okay. All right. Now that actually I live on Galveston Island, so I'm able to get fresh shrimp. So it works out well for me. And it's just if the manufacturer freezes it, right? It's
Hmm.
not,
Correct.
if you freeze it,
Yes.
it's not like a chemical process going
No, it's something that they physically dip the meat into
on.
to
Okay.
freeze it. Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. And so just a shout out to Yolanda because she picked out all three of the phosphorus in the label that you
Yay.
did. Yes, wonderful. And Yolanda also wanted to ask, hold on, let me find it again. Oh, Wesley wanted to know what about non-dairy? I had the same question. So oatmeal milk or cheese or almond milk. What about those?
Well, remember that the plant-based sources of protein are going to be beans, nuts, and seeds. So when we think about something like soy or cashew milk or almond milk, it will still have phosphorus in it because those plant-based sources are still a source of phosphorus. But plant-based foods, phosphorus is about 1/3 available. And animal-based foods, phosphorus is about 50% or half available. So even though it's still present there, it's a slightly better choice for soy or almond milk than cow's milk, but it is still present. Now, for something like oat milk, because it is not a plant-based source of phosphorus, that is a fairly low phosphorus food. Now, one thing you also have to consider with any type of non-dairy food is you still want to look for phosphorus additives. A
Mm,
lot of our coffee creamers, for instance, that are flavored, whether they're pumpkin spice or vanilla or peppermint or whatever, sometimes those flavoring agents will have phosphorus additives in them. So always still look at the label and the ingredient list for that reason. But natural phosphorus, they
okay.
tend to be a little bit better choices.
Okay. Well, maybe there's some way that we can create our own at home pumpkin spice, right? I
And
mean,
again, limit. I do that with
limited,
my own
yes.
coffee creamer instead of just free pouring. I do measure it out, and I
Okay.
found that
Yeah.
a tablespoon is perfectly adequate for me. My flavor and taste might be a little bit different from somebody else's, and so again, the amount of phosphorus in that's negligible
Okay. All right. So all things, right? Just
in moderation.
moderation. Okay. Yolanda wants to know, is it recommended to take phosphate binders before, during, or after eating the meals? I know that was something whenever I was on dialysis, I was confused about as well. And in addition to her question, I'm curious, how many different types of phosphorus binders are there today? Like back whenever I was on it, I think there was just one.
Yeah.
So hit Yolanda's question first.
Sure. So I'll start with when to take it, the timing with meals. The absolute best answer to that is with the first bite. And the reason why is that the phosphorus binder, it breaks apart in the stomach, or some of them even in the small intestine, and it sort of sits there and it's just waiting for the food. Now, if you take it too far in advance, you take it an hour before you eat, it will end up getting flushed out of the system before you ever get to where you're sitting down and eating. But if you take it right with that first bite, then it has the best chance to absorb the most phosphorus from the food. If you wait until the middle of the meal or the end of the meal, you're still going to get some benefit from the binder because food does take 20 or 30 minutes to leave the stomach, and it takes about an hour to leave the small intestine. So you can still get some benefit, but you're going to miss out on those first few bites. And so, for that reason, the absolute best time is right with that first bite. And as for your question about how many are on the market today, well, you're right. Back in the 90s, I think we really, I mean, calcium acetate and Tums calcium carbonate were the most common used. Renvela or sevelamer carbonate had entered the market at that point in time, and it really, I think through 2014, still had a patent where it was not available by way of a generic, but it is today. Lanthanum carbonate came next. It was kind of early 2000s. And then in 2014 and 15, we had two iron-based binders enter the market, Velphoro and Auryxia. And those binders are the ones that are just now coming to where their patents are coming to a close, and they'll be generic within the next few years. There is another medication that just became FDA approved recently within the last 12 months. It's called Exposa. It works in a totally different way. It is not truly a binder. It actually blocks phosphorus from being absorbed in the gut. But if you want to consider it still in the same class of medications, then that would give us actually a sixth choice that's available today.
Okay. I do have one other question about the phosphorus. So, do the phosphorus binders, do they have different mechanisms of action? So, let's say, sometimes you take a blood pressure medication and it just doesn't work so great for you. Is it possible that a patient try a different type or is it more based on, you taking it as prescribed, or is it like a combination of all things?
I think it's a little bit of everything. So, as for mechanism of action, they're all pretty similar. They're just, again, all positively charged
Yeah.
molecules that are trying to absorb the negatively charged phosphorus. Now, the molecule itself is a little bit different. In the case of calcium acetate, it's calcium, which is a 2+ positive charge, and phosphorus is a 4 negative charge. Um, and you look at something like sevelamer carbonate or Renvela, it's actually a manufactured molecule that's positively charged, that's absorbing the phosphorus. Now, as for could there be a better binder for a particular person? Yes, there can be, because each one of these they work in different environments. So I'll give Velphoro as an example. Velphoro is the only binder that can work in a really, really low pH environment. So it can work in the stomach and it can work in the intestines because the stomach has a very low pH, intestines have a much higher one. Most of the other binders, they really start to work more in the intestines. And so that's one of the reasons why Velphoro has such incredible binding capacity because it can work from the minute the food hits the stomach to the minute it ends up in the large intestine. Um, so yeah, all of the binders are a little bit different. Somebody who's had some type of stomach surgery or gastric surgery may do better with one binder versus another. And then they all kind of absorb again in different parts of the stomach. So sometimes dual therapy and taking two different ones, sort of like you do with blood pressure medication, can be helpful as well.
Okay. So it's at least something a patient could discuss
Sure.
with their provider. Hey, is there, maybe another drug would work.
And
Um,
I always like to say it's the binder that you're able to take too. So if
oh,
one of
that's
them
true
makes you
because
nauseous,
if it's a horse
one
pill, if
you can't swallow
it's
one, then that's not the best one
hard.
for you.
Okay. Does home dialysis help with phosphorus removal?
So home dialysis removes about the same amount of phosphorus as does hemodialysis. The difference is you do home dialysis a little more frequently. So if you're doing like home hemodialysis and it's 5 days a week, you're going to get a little bit more phosphorus removal than you would from in center dialysis. PD, same thing, because you're doing it 7 nights a week, you get a little bit more phosphorus removal from PD than you do from in center.
Okay. I think this is a little off topic, but we do have a couple minutes.
Yeah,
So, you being a dietitian, let's see. What forms of protein are best worst? How much can be eaten in a month? Example, beef, fish, chicken, cheese, whole eggs.
sure. So, all protein is good. What you're looking for here is in answering this question, I look for proteins that are going to be the most heart healthy for a person. Because again, cardiovascular disease is the number one risk factor. It's the number one cause of hospitalizations and ultimately death in people who are on dialysis. Heart disease can be very serious in dialysis. And so when I look for proteins, I like looking at things like fish and white meat, whether it's chicken or whether it's white meat pork, as better choices of protein because of the fact that they're more heart healthy than something like beef. But that's not to say that you can't include other sources of protein here. So usually what I like to say with patients is plant-based proteins. I pretty much give people the thumbs up to have those every single day. Those are good sources of protein to include. Eggs are a good source of protein. They're some of the most least expensive proteins that we have out there. And again, we saw that protein to phosphorus ratio and how low it was in an egg. And so that can be a good choice really on a daily basis for dialysis patients.
Easy
When
to
it comes
make too, right? And
to
lots of
what?
varieties. Easy to make
Yes.
and lots of different varieties.
Yep.
Yeah.
They the big joke out there among chefs, and I don't know if this is actually true or not, but they talk about how they have folds in their hat. They're the tall chef hat. It's supposed to be one fold for every different way you can prepare an egg. So they're very versatile foods.
I would believe
Um,
that. I would believe that. So, Christine just made a comment. She learned so much today. So,
Good.
bravo, Nadia. I think we might. Oh, we do have another question, and
Okay.
then we're probably going to have to wrap it up. Perhaps, if there's other ones in the chat, there are a couple. Let's see how we go.
Okay.
Excellent question. What about air frying?
I mean, air frying does not
Yeah.
add all of that oil that you get
Yes.
from frying in a pan. And so
Excellent.
for that reason, it is more like baking something in an oven.
Okay.
It's just baked at a super high temperature, so it becomes a lot more crispy
Okay.
quicker. And for those people who have kids, I have older teens now, so they're a little safer to use the oven. But when they were younger, that was the way that I wanted them to heat up a lot of their food because it was safer to use. But an air fryer can be a much better choice again because you're not adding some of the fats and oils and some of the least heart healthy types of products to your food.
Okay, so we're right on time. We have two more questions. Maybe you could answer them quickly and then we'll move
Sure.
on. Thank you everybody for all of your questions, but these are going to be the last two. somebody wanted to know how does Tums act as a binder?
Mhm.
And the other one is regarding electrolytes. I've been told that when I have cramps to eat potassium, drink water, but I find calcium and water work better for me.
Okay, so I'll start with the Tums. Tums is calcium carbonate. So calcium's a positively charged molecule, just like the calcium we find in calcium acetate or the iron that we find in something like Belphora or Rixia. So Tums work exactly the same way as any other binder. That positively charged calcium is just grabbing that negatively charged phosphorus in the gut. As for electrolytes, remember muscle contraction involves really a ton of different electrolytes. Potassium's positively charged, so is calcium, so is sodium, and then you have negatively charged things like chloride and phosphorus. And it's the exchange of those at the muscle that makes electrolytes work the way that they do. And so you're right, some people will find that potassium works well for cramps and others will find calcium. They're both positively charged, so it's just that exchange at the muscle level that's causing the cramps to go away.
Okay, well, Nadia, thank you so much. I mean, really, renal dietitians, one of my favorite presenters. Love it. You had a lot of information. Thanks again for coming and enjoying Hope Week with us.